A Pew report out today says that in the past 7 years, the number of Americans who don't belong to an organized religion has grown by nearly 20 million.
This is a dilemma that all of the churches, Christian and non-Christian, within the United States are facing.
According to Pew, for every convert to Christianity, there are 4 Christians who have left the faith.
There are some who leave the church they once loved. One might ask, if the gospel is so wonderful, why would anyone leave?
People don't comprehend what you lose. People don't comprehend the nights of lost sleep, how many hundreds of hours you spend in these issues trying to put them back together, only to find 25 more issues that are problematic.
It is like Santa Claus. It is like the tooth fairy. You believe all of these things, and then suddenly someone said, well, it's not that way. And then you begin to wonder.
When you leave a high-demand religion like Mormonism, it's not just like changing social clubs. It's not just like changing your sweater. It could ruin your marriage. You could become disowned by your parents. Your children could lose respect for you. You could lose your employment. You could lose your identity. You lose your sense of spirituality, your sense of meaning, your sense of purpose. It is thoroughly devastating.
Not only are we seeing fewer people staying with the church, but actually lower levels of confidence in some of the church's basic teachings.
I can tell there's something happening. There's just people are struggling with, I don't know if it's the demands or the history of the church, but there's definitely people are having, trouble with it.
We're not talking about women's issues. We're not talking about the historicity of the Book of Mormon in a way that tells a full enough story. It's like there's almost an unspoken law that certain uncomfortable things are not to be discussed at church.
We are perpetually in the midst of the crisis of needing to, with every generation, figure out again how to be Mormon.
If we don't stem the hemorrhage quickly, then I think we are at risk of becoming a shrinking church and one that gets marginalized to the periphery of Christianity.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Reynolds. I'm the author of the CES letter. I was born in 1981, and I was born in a Mormon family in 7th generation. My ancestors go all the way back to the days of Joseph Smith. It was nowhere in my radar that I would leave the church. And there was an interview that, well, I'm not sure, it was more of a Q&A that Elder Marlon K. Jensen, who was the church historian at the time, gave at, I believe, Utah State University. And he was asked about the effect of Google on membership and about people leaving in droves over church history.
Maybe at Vince Kirtland, we never had a period, I'll call it apostasy, like we're having right now, largely over these issues.
That really shocked me because it really shocked me in the sense of why are people leaving over historical issues? What historical issues are there that people are leaving over? And so I put up Google.
My faith crisis over church history began long before Google. I was a freshman at the University of Southern California, and I went into the USC library and I checked out a copy of The Godmakers, which was a very popular anti-Mormon book. It was actually a book and a movie. And it described a church that was far more sinister and bizarre than the relatively boring church that I had grown up in.
Mormonism teaches that trillions of planets scattered throughout the cosmos are ruled by countless gods who once were human like us. Mormons believe that Elohim is their heavenly father and that he lives with his many goddess wives on a planet near a mysterious star called Korah. Here, the God of Mormonism and his wives, through endless celestial sex, produced billions of spirit children.
Endless celestial sex. It talked about God living on Starbase Kolob. It referred to Mormons worshiping the Mormon Jesus as opposed to, Jesus. And I read this and I thought, I felt like a chump. I felt like how is it that I grew up in this church and I didn't know any of this?
So I just started this rabbit hole into researching church history and trying to come to terms with my testimony and what I experienced in the church, the goodness that I experienced in the church, my spiritual experiences, and trying to match the narrative that I'm hearing right now to the narrative that I grew up in.
I went home for Christmas, and over Christmas break, the Elders Quorum was passing out copies of a book called The Truth About the God-Makers by Gilbert W. Scharfs. I had no idea who Gilbert W. Scharfs was, but I devoured this book, which went line by line through the God-Makers and pointed out where they were getting things wrong, where they were pulling things out of context. And it calmed me down. It put a brake on my panic and gave me enough time to explore these issues for myself. But it showed me that people can confront these issues and still come out with a testimony on the other side. And my understanding is that's exactly the opposite of Jeremy Runnels' experience.
Yeah, so about a year of research, going back to 2012, a year of research and going through this, I realized that there's serious problems and I need official church answers. The spring of 2013, my grandfather, he had a friend who was a CES director. And he proposed the idea that I meet with the CES director to see if I could get my concerns and questions answered and resolved. The way I operate is if I have a lot of questions, I want all of them answered. I decided to just open up my computer and write down everything. Write down all of the questions I have and all the concerns and all the inconsistencies that I'm seeing. And that document ended up being about 85 pages. And so I saved it as a PDF and attached it to an email and sent it to the CES director. He responded that it was very well written and that he would provide me a response. And so that was in 2013, and I never heard back from the CES director again.
People try to hold on. They'll often go talk to their bishop. They'll talk to people trying to get answers, trying to understand, trying to find a way. And when they don't find anyone who can help them, who will be willing to speak about their issues with them, who are just willing to listen rather than just telling them that they need to be doing more in order to earn some sort of testimony, then they start finding the sources who will.
I had no choice but to read the CES letter. I was a little afraid to read the CES letter because I thought this must be the most devastating expose of the church that has ever been written.
There's a quote that I heard in this when I was in this process of learning church history. It's a quote by President J. Reuben Clark. He said, "If we have the truth, it cannot be harmed by investigation. If we had not the truth, it ought to be harmed."
I read the CES letter and I got God-Makers flashbacks. You know, so many of the issues that had been in the God-Makers were also in the CES letter. And I thought, I want to respond to this. I want to pay Gilbert W. Scharfs forward. So I'm not a scholar, but I am a blogger. I had written about a lot of these issues on my blog. And I started cutting and pasting pieces of my blog in direct response to Jeremy Runnels' CES letter. And 150,000 words later, I had a line-by-line response to what Jeremy had written.
You know, I grew up with the understanding that there's anti-Mormonism, that there's anti-Mormons out there that are trying to destroy your testimony with lies and all kinds of falsehoods. And so it was pretty scary to look into that because of that paradigm that I was given growing up. But the more and more that I research this anti-Mormonism, the more I realize that it's just true. It's just factual information.
One of the things that I discovered while writing my reply is that people can look at the same set of facts and come to a very different set of conclusions.
I read Rough Stone Rolling by Richard Bushman, and it strengthened my testimony, where a lot of people read it and it's somehow have the opposite effect.
Even today, leaders say, don't even look at any of this stuff. But that doesn't work in the age of the internet. It's no longer possible to control how and where people get their information about church history. And the church has no choice but to confront these issues head on.
It strikes me as a historian of the LDS past that there has hardly been an epoch in which there weren't tremendous inconveniences to one's faith, whether it was the 19th century practice of polygamy, or whether it was the Adam God theory of Brigham Young, or blood atonement, or Brigham Young's theocratic practices in the 19th century. I think that we're always being tested by our response to these inconveniences or difficulties.
How and why might I stay a Latter-day Saint, given some things about our practice that I think could be improved or changed? I think about that not altogether differently than I think about my citizenship in our great, fabulous gift of a country. I think there's all sorts of aspects that are broken in how we're conducting ourselves, in how our representatives go about our laws, and how our highest leaders exemplify what's worthwhile in the country. But I'm not tempted to leave it. I'm tempted to try to participate, heal it where I can.
There's a school of thought within Mormonism. There's a particular orientation to the Mormon church now where it goes something to the effect of, if you know the facts, if you read the CES letter, for example, then there's no way you can stay Mormon, because the evidence is just too glaring. There's too much contrary evidence to the truth claims to actually stay Mormon. And I'm actually really sympathetic to that perspective. I don't refute it absolutely. I think it hinges on how we define what it means to be Mormon. If I'm Mormon because I believe that there are historical, unalterable truths and claims that if they were ever disclaimed or proven to be false, then I would just be without a religion. I would just be out of luck. I don't personally define Mormonism that way, and I think there are more and more people who recognize that Mormonism isn't just about books and buildings, and it's not even about truth claims per se. I've heard it spoken from the pulpit. Mormonism, in a sense, is who we are, and it's who we're becoming. And we can profess certain beliefs. Someone can say, I believe that the Book of Mormon is a historical artifact, and someone else could say, I don't believe that. But that belief won't give you a whole lot of information about the person's heart and their soul and how much they've been able to transcend their own selfish impulses and love their neighbor.
We covenant to build up the kingdom of God. That's what Zion is. And maybe instead of building Zion as a destination, Zion has to be the journey. Zion is a moment when we're sitting with someone who disagrees with us about faith. And we find a way to have a conversation that meets everybody where they're at and doesn't try to change them. I think for me that's where I'm at now. Is I'm not interested in rescuing people. I'm not interested in changing people. I'm just interested in sitting with them, and asking that they do the same for me.
My reply to the CES letter went viral. It's been downloaded tens of thousands of times, and it got me some attention from a podcaster who put me on his podcast, and Jeremy Runnels heard it. And he sent me this really nasty email. Jim, just wanted to thank you for doing the interviews with Bill. You really stepped into it big time and hung yourself with a lot of rope. I mean, shockingly, a lot of rope. I couldn't have asked for anything better, and it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. And I sent him a nasty email back, and we went back and forth. And finally I said, wouldn't this be more fun over burgers? I'm buying. We went to lunch. Jeremy Runnels is a really good guy. Jeremy felt like he needed to leave the church. And I think that's a valid choice. I looked at all the same issues and didn't feel like I needed to leave the church, and I think it actually strengthened my faith. I think that's a valid choice. I think we need to be able to talk to each other.
There is so much that needs to be done in terms of people in and out of the church, people who are leaving the church, to be able to maintain communication and maintain goodwill and maintain solid relationships.
I had some good experiences in Mormonism, but at the same time, I think we can relate to this. There were some harmful teachings in Mormonism as well.
I absolutely believe we have no choice but to confront the issues you raise in the CES letter head on.
It would be the height of arrogance for me to say, I know what's best for you in your life. I don't know what's best for you. It's just the way it is. I mean, we're all in the same boat together. We're all trying to come to grips with this new reality and this new narrative that we're discovering.
It's funny, yeah, because my first instinct goes towards defending the inconvenience of it. That is, in my understanding of religion, the nature of religion, to push people deeper into thinking about their beliefs in the doctrines and the practices and the culture of the church.
One of the things we have to do, it seems to me, is to be able to live in paradox, to live in tension, live with a certain amount of uncertainty. I think that's what it means to live by faith.
Any expectations that everything needs to be tied up in a nice, neat bow violates the very principle of agency that the gospel plan is founded in.
The world is not clean and pure and black and white. It is by necessity confusing and contradictory at times, because that's how we grow. In the church, we see doubt as a sin. Doubt is a virtue.
We need to have doubt in order to have freedom.
So we need to be more willing to lean into that discomfort and not just run away from it or think that the Spirit has fled us when we're experiencing some growing pains. If we only understood that some of these questions of faith lead to great growth in our connection with the divine.
The gospel has to be picked up and lived all over again from the inside out by every generation that comes. It's never enough to just inherit the forms of religion that worked for our parents in their times, in their contexts. Part of what it means for the church to be not just true but living is that we are perpetually faced with the task of having to start again.